Welcome everybody to Where Do We Go From Here, a discussion and debate on the future for the movement for Black lives and the struggle to build a just society. I know you could be anywhere and doing anything, so it really means a lot that you're here with us, especially raising money for such great causes. I want to thank, first of all, the best bookstore in all the land, Harvard Bookstore, and my dear friend Jeff Mayerson for hosting this discussion. The panelists are all authors of some of the most important works ever written on race in the American experience, and I strongly, strongly encourage you to purchase their texts and other works that you're interested in from Harvard Bookstore and other independent booksellers. I also want to thank our other host, the incredible Boston Review, and its lead editors, Deb Chasman and Josh Cohen. All of us have been proud contributors to the rich intellectual tradition curated by Boston Review. And I just think it's really important to say in this moment, before our country's more famous publications were willing to run pieces on police and prison abolition, racial capitalism, Black radical thought, and the ethics of resistance to state and market violence, Boston Review really provided one of the major forums for these ideas to be debated with seriousness and subtlety, and it still does. There are not many publications who can match Boston Review's commitment to publishing Black thinkers, to giving space to debates about Black liberation from across the political spectrum, or insisting on the significance of race to broader questions of justice, democracy, and citizenship. So it's a real honor to be here at a panel co-hosted by Boston Review. And just as a reminder, as Serena said, the contributions from this evening's event, which I hope you continue to contribute, all go to three important organizations: Critical Resistance, one of the leading voices of the prison abolitionist movement; National Bailout, an organization devoted to ending mass incarceration and the practice of pretrial detention; and OWL, or One Woman's Love, an organization committed to empowering Black women and girls in Stockton, California. So our format today will be about 40 to 45 minutes of discussion that I'll moderate between the panelists. Before I take questions from you all, the audience, please use the Q&A button below and send us your questions all throughout the panel, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Now, I've been excited about this for weeks. As far as I'm concerned, it's hard to imagine a panel of scholars more exciting than the one you're about to hear today. And I apologize for not being able to go into long introductions because all these people are so accomplished that it would take up all the time. So I want you to look them up when we finish talking today and hear more about their work. But I'm just going to go in alphabetical order for quick introductions. So first we have woman I think is the most influential and important historian of the carceral state in our generation, and the newly appointed professor of law and Associate Professor of African American Studies and History at Yale University, my dear sister, Elizabeth Hinton, who's author of the Phi Beta Kappa prize-winning book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. Second, we have one of the few towering interpreters of African American history, UCLA's Gary Nash Professor of American History, Robin D.G. Kelley, whose classic works, Hammer and Hoe, Race Rebels, Freedom Dreams, and his award-winning biography of Thelonious Monk have fundamentally reshaped how we write and think about race, class, gender, and resistance. Third, we have my dear brother, Harvard's professor of the practice of public philosophy, Cornell West, who in my mind is a true intellectual giant. His writings in philosophy, social theory, and cultural criticism, especially Keeping Faith, Prophesied Deliverance, Race Matters, and Democracy Matters, amount to an indispensable archive for thinking through the spiritual, cultural, and political crises of the modern age. And last, but certainly not least, we have Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who in the past few years has become arguably the most prominent Black radical thinker of our generation. And she's produced some of the most widely read and debated reflections on contemporary politics and the movement for Black lives. Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Princeton, Keeanga's works include From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, How We Get Free, Black Feminism in the Combahee River Collective, and the Pulitzer Prize finalist, Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black ownership, home ownership. This is an amazing group, And without any further ado, I hope you give them a round of applause at home, and let's dive into what they have to say. So let me begin with Robin, who in a recent interview you gave with The Intercept, pressed an argument that I thought was really provocative and one that I thought could orient our discussion today. You drew on Reverend Barber, who's one of the leaders of the Poor People's Campaign, in saying that we're living through a third Reconstruction, or at least an attempted third Reconstruction. And I'm just curious as to what you mean by that phrase, and how do you think it helps us understand what's at stake in the present?
Right. Thank you. Thank you. It's also great to be with this amazing group of people. First, of course, Reverend Barber used that term in his book, Third Reconstruction. And I would also give credit to Angela Davis, because when Angela published the book, Abolition Democracy, in some ways what she was proposing was recognizing the first Reconstruction and what Du Bois had identified as abolition democracy, and then proposing it for a third. And so by third Reconstruction, if you sort of look at the different moments, the first Reconstruction, of course, was an attempt by formerly enslaved people to expand social democracy to include everyone. And of course, it was crushed under Jim Crow, racial terror, disfranchisement. The second Reconstruction, again, was an attempt to expand democracy for everyone. Again, still based on a kind of constitutional understanding that somehow the promise of America hadn't been fulfilled. So there's this fundamental constitutional claim that we have to sort of tweak our struggle and provide those kinds of rights that weren't provided before. And part of that also includes economic justice. And that's why the second Reconstruction dealt with issues of housing, police violence, that sort of thing. The third Reconstruction, I would argue, is not simply an attempt to end poverty, but it really is an attempt to sort of remake not just the United States, but the world, recognizing that this country in the modern world was founded on dispossession, white supremacy, gendered violence. And this vision of abolition is not simply the vision of abolition that informs the third Reconstruction. Is not simply, again, tweaking the Constitution. It's not about better jails, better policing, better training, but a new means of sort of remaking justice as a whole. And by justice, we don't just mean, overturning criminalization, but creating a kind of affirmation, an affirmative form of justice based on restorative justice, reparation for 500 years of oppression, and also just really creating new possibilities for life, to deal with the catastrophe of the environment, to deal with freeing the body from all the constraints of gender and sexual norms. That this is a much wider vision of freedom based on a kind of abolitionist project. But then the last thing I have to say about this is that, like every Reconstruction, there's always the backlash, and so the first and second Reconstructions didn't just simply fail, they were overthrown, completely overthrown. I mean, and what we're witnessing now or facing now is a potential for that reversal, for that overthrow, if we can even achieve some of the things I'm mentioning. But we're facing a future that could be either liberatory or fascist, and or something else in between that. But that's sort of how I see it, in terms of this opportunity. It's really unprecedented in some ways.
So, seeing how central prison and police abolition is to this vision of the third Reconstruction, I think what's really interesting about the last few weeks is that these ideas have been more central to debate than at any time in my memory, or I think at any time in American history. But even with the insurgence of that, that line of critique into the public sphere, it's still no secret that large segments of Black communities are, to put the point kind of politely, ambivalent, or at least afraid of the implications of the demands for defunding the police or abolishing the police. They know the history, Elizabeth, that you've written a lot about, of selective hearing of calls for reform. And they're worried that people are only going to hear defund the police, not invest in anything else. They don't have the luxury of treating community violence as an abstract question. We know in the 4 weeks following George Floyd's killing, murders in Chicago rose by 79% over last year's numbers. New York and Baltimore saw a 31 and 17% jump, respectively. And I think one thing that concerns people who live in these communities is that the violence seems in some ways different than the violence that a lot of you have written about from the 1990s, which was more tightly tied to the drug economy. And they're concerned about what to do with the possibility of abandonment in a time of austerity, and what to do with crime in the midst of these demands for abolition. So what I'm hoping for is Elizabeth and Keeanga, if you could speak to what kind of account of community crime and violence these people calling for defunding the police or abolition can give to persuade more members of working class Black communities to adopt their views and support the fullest third Reconstruction that Robin's outlining.
I'm not entirely convinced that there isn't widespread support for exactly what Robin is talking about in low-income urban communities. So just as an example, the organization that I'm fundraising for here, the OWL movement, provides aftercare and services to families affected by violence in Stockton. So, Stockton is a place that has higher rates of poverty and gun violence than places that we often think of, like Chicago. And many of the families who have lost their loved ones to violence, especially if those murders are labeled as gang related, are completely denied any kind of crime compensation benefits. So that's where the OWL movement stepped into this vacuum, this void of funding for fundamental services, offering memorial services, empowerment workshops, healing circles, and prayer as a way to deal with many of these community problems that in a place where the state has not. In the 5 years since the OWL movement has been operating, there's $25 million for fighting gang violence in Stockton, right? So I think that already we're seeing a shift. This is why I think the OWL movement and organizations like it are the future. We're seeing this shift from things that are premised on violence to care, and that's what that kind of reimagining what justice really means, one that is premised on community care and care of our communities, I think is the future, and I think that's what abolition is all about. On the, just briefly, I think that the fact that we're having these conversations about social harm in Black communities within this kind of larger context of policing and incarceration is really important. It's not as if the kind of social harm that we're seeing exists in a vacuum or that it's disentangled from police and incarceration, right? Because there is a cycle of state-sanctioned and collective community violence, and people who harm others have very often been harmed themselves, right? So what we need to be asking is, why is it that in communities where police and surveillance and incarceration looms large, people of color are more likely to die prematurely? And this process really begins as police forces are militarized and as the war on crime unfolds in the 1960s, right? And we get rebellions directed against external state forces, thousands of rebellions, and not just during the long hot summers of the 1960s, right? And not just in big cities. So the hard question that I think we need to frame, even these conversations about social harm or violence in more recent years, is how this external collective violence that was directed against state forces turns internal, how there's a three-pronged war that emerges when the federal government begins to wage war on communities of color, right? There's a struggle against state forces, and there's also a struggle that emerges within Black communities themselves against one another. So these conversations can't be separated from police and incarceration itself, especially since incarceration, right, is the root of many of these informal economies, and the circumstances of collective confinement provided the means through which many of these groups could organize, and who facilitates the informal economies in prisons. It's not the visitors, right? It's the guards, it's the police. So what we need to be asking is how this state violence precipitates violence, and disentangling the conditions that lead to what we're seeing in places like Chicago and Baltimore today.
Keeanga, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to say about this. The first thing that I would say is that crime is a real problem in the lives and communities of poor and working class Black people. And there's no point in trying to evade that, or to sugarcoat it, or to try to describe it as something other than what it is. But I do think it's important to say that this debate and discussion emerges out of the failures of what has preceded it. So in terms of even just the issue of police reform, I think part of the reason why things have gravitated so quickly to defund the police is because the failures of the reforms out of 2014 and 2015 are so new that they're hard to just explain away and dismiss, as elected officials typically try to do over time, to kind of distort the history of the failures of their own reform. We all remember the centrality of body cameras, that this was going to solve the problem. You know, more Black police officers, better community, all this stuff, the same recycled arguments that we've heard for the last 50 years since the Kerner Commission, and a few new ones sprinkled in during the first iteration of Black Lives Matter. We've all heard them, we've seen them, and they continue to fail. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is, imagine that we spend such a grotesque amount of money on police, and yet here we still are talking about the rise, the wave of crime, its ebb and its flow. In Chicago, they spend 40% of the operating budget on police. And we are talking about a rise or a spike in crime during the summer over the last few weekends. So clearly, investing exclusively in policing has not solved the problem. And I think the lack of resolution because of that has opened up the possibility of new formulations, new ideas around this. And I think part of it is saying that we have spent the last generation defunding public education, defunding public hospitals, defunding public libraries, defunding the entire public infrastructure that makes cities operate. And that hasn't worked. And it has produced, in the second decade of the 20th century, the same kinds of issues that we were dealing with throughout the 3/4 of the 20th century. So maybe we need to do something else. Maybe we need to do something different. And I think that there's a lot of space for support, deliberation, conversation about this issue if it's actually had out. But the immediate response of the political class is to either ridicule the idea, to dismiss it out of hand, and to bring us back to this narrow framework of police or no police. And so when you're talking to ordinary people who are dealing with crime on a daily basis in their neighborhoods, and that's the option, police or no police, then you automatically foreclose a different kind of conversation. What we're saying is that, yes, we want to redirect the tens of billions of dollars that goes to police so that we live in cities where public health workers are dressed in garbage bags and reusing masks during a pandemic. And the police look like they have just stepped out of some Hollywood feature film about futuristic policing, 100 years from now. That we need to change the calculus, where it's the schools that get funding, There's investment in jobs, there's investment in healthcare, there's investment in a completely different quality of life. And I guarantee you, if you put that in the poll, if you frame the discussion around that, should we be paying the police to kick people's asses all over the neighborhood? Or should we be investing in transforming the institutions that make up public life in cities? That it's a no-brainer. It's not a contest. But we haven't framed the debate that way, and that's part of what the urgency of these kinds of conversations is that there's an ideological war, there's an ideological battle. We've been told that there's not enough money. We've been told that budgets have to be cut, but somehow that never applies to the police. It only applies to everything else. So we're saying we have to change that. Let's change the discussion. Let's have the ideological debate, because I'm confident in our side. I don't know about theirs.
I think this raises the next crucial point, which is the picture you're painting, Keeanga, is one that sounds a lot like the democratic socialist vision that's animated much of the resurgent left over the last few years, that anchored a certain wing of the Bernie Sanders campaign, which is the most successful democratic socialist presidential campaign in US history. But again, it leads us back to a crucial problem, which is that when those ideas were on the table in the electoral arena, they lost in no small part due to Black working class voters voting instead for Joe Biden. Brother West, you put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the Sanders campaign. You've been on the board of DSA for decades. You've been making this case in churches and communities. What is your autopsy of the Sanders defeat and its prospects for rejuvenated democratic socialist vision? And how do you overcome the resistance, even if it's just a strategic resistance and not an ideological one? I think Keeanga's point is really crucial there. How do you overcome the strategic resistance of a voting bloc on your account that would be more profoundly well served by this vision of politics when they instead seem to more fully trust the judgment of James Clyburn?
No, indeed. Well, first, I want to just begin by saluting you, my dear brother. Just anxiously await your masterpiece on the tragic vision, civil rights movement, to be in dialogue with my brothers and sisters here, each one of them just such a profound source of inspiration for me, not just their magisterial scholarship, but who they are as human beings. And then I salute Sister Deb and Brother Josh and Sister Serena as well. But no, I think what we're dealing with in part, though, brother, is the massive failure of Black leadership and the failure of the Black intelligentsia to be able to intervene in such a way that we can convince our brothers and sisters of all colors, but disproportionately chocolate, that the vision, analysis, and the kind of work we need on the ground that puts poor and working people at the center remains on the fringes. And said instead, we got neoliberal Black leadership and neoliberal Black intellectuals who are their cheerleaders that don't allow the kind of vision analysis. And then when the social movements hit, they want to act as if they're at the center of it rather than in fact have been on the other side. So we have to be able to tell everybody, we have to tell our brothers and sisters of all colors the truth. And the truth is always a very painful one. And the truth is that I think we're living in an undeniably decaying, declining American empire with a militarized nation state that's militaristic abroad with AFRICOM and Africa and dropping bombs in the Middle East and presence in Latin America, 800 military units, 53% for every dollar goes to the military. So we got to talk about defunding the Pentagon. But then at the same time, we've got a Wall Street centered economy tied to wealth inequality that Brother Bernie was talking about. And but our leadership is tied to Wall Street. So that Wall Street domination is a precondition of most of our neoliberal Black leadership. So we can't even get at the fundamental source, you see. But then we got a commodified a culture where everything's for sale, everybody's for sale, including the media and education, and therefore notions of integrity, notions of honesty, notions of taking a risk, notions of cutting against the grain are going to push you to the margins in terms of the preoccupation with what the culture is about, which is money and spectacle and image, which is spiritual crisis, you see. So that we have to be honest enough to tell our fellow citizens that this is the larger context. This is the great legacy of Du Bois and C.L.R. James and Richard Wright and Toni Morrison and Ida B. Wells and others. That's the tradition from which we come. And given this particular moment, it means we have to be willing to say, lo and behold, we've got too many leaders, too many intellectuals, too many artists, too many actors, too many entertainers who are not open to this kind of vision and analysis, what Brother Robin called freedom dreams, using our imagination to authorize an alternative vision and reality of the nightmare's presence, as it were. And I'll say this in conclusion, that Sister Keeanga, for me, has written the two best pieces of what I'm talking about. And I want folk to go out and read it. In the New Yorker, what was the name of that, Keeanga? How do you change America? I think it is.
How do we change America?
How do we change America? Absent in the end of black politics and in the New York Times. Now, how you got into those neoliberal venues, I'm praying for you. It's a beautiful thing. But your voice is Socratic and prophetic in that way. And we need more of those voices as a cacophony of voices, but rooted in truth-telling, integrity, honesty, so that we can convince folk that if Black people, for example, are the most progressive voting bloc in the American empire, but they cannot support the most progressive candidate in the history of the empire when it comes to president, Brother Bernie Sanders, then something is happening. That's a Keith Sweat moment. Something just ain't right. Well, the neoliberal hegemony of our leadership and our intelligentsia in many ways is getting in the way. And we have to be honest about that, critical with each other in a loving way, but in a very tenacious way.
Well, if you had Keith Sweat on your Black intellectual bingo card, you are the winner today. But this is a great transition, because I really, really want to talk about Keeanga's piece in the Times, which I think is really important as well. And you say something there that really struck me. You say that class tensions among African Americans have produced new fault lines that the romance of racial solidarity simply cannot overcome. Mm. And you call for a new era of Black politics. But I want to press two questions that I hope you can clarify here. The first is, if this class fracturing is so profound that it can't overcome, that the romance of racial solidarity can't overcome it, why call for any new Black politics at all? Why not just pronounce the whole edifice of Black solidarity dead once and for all? So you might think, for example, that the whole rhetoric of our shared universal racial vulnerability to police violence and the appeal to Black solidarity that kind of framing engenders is not just analytically misguided, so it obscures the number of white brothers and sisters who are killed by the police, Native American brothers and sisters who are killed by the police, the Latinx brothers and sisters killed by the police. You might think it's not just analytically misguided, but it's politically dangerous. So you think of somebody like Adolph Reed, who would say that these frames allow for Black elites to redirect a moral revulsion at police violence toward diversifying corporate board seats and affirmative action and elite education, things like that, that don't redress the fundamental problems of economic democracy that you're laying out so powerfully. Why don't we just give up the language of Black politics altogether, so that when you speak out in the New York Times, everybody can see more clearly what's at stake when you criticize something like the Congressional Black Caucus?
Well, because I think that Black politics still has resonance, and it's not because of, something that I say or something that, some talking head says. It's because Black people continue to be an oppressed minority in the United States, and that even even when there are intra-class tensions among Black people, even among the Black political class or the Black elite, there is still a vulnerability to racism, even when their class position might mitigate it. And so, you know, I can be extremely critical of someone like Muriel Bowser, the mayor of Washington, D.C., and it doesn't change the fact that her politics are, you know, neoliberal, and she's viciously attacked by Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and it's racist and it's sexist. And so the reason why she can have resonance among ordinary Black people is because of that. And so that possibility of what Michael Dawson talks about as linked fate, it still exists. It's of course much different than it was in the pre-Jim Crow or the pre-civil rights era, where of course there have always been class tensions among African Americans, but Jim Crow helped to compress the Black community into you know, singular spaces where there had to be some means of coexistence. And so things don't exist to that same degree, but there is still sympathy that exists among Black people. I mean, that's why Barack Obama, despite his very kind of benign presidency, when it came to actually improving the condition of Black people, is still incredibly popular among African Americans. It's why Michelle Obama is incredibly popular among African Americans. So, you know, that being said, I do think that the further that we get away from the period of civil rights and the period of the kind of political insurgency that erupted during that period, the more that the class lines in Black communities have become entrenched. I think when, you know, when I had started thinking about that article probably 3 weeks before it came out, and what I originally was going to begin with in the article was the mayor of New Orleans, I believe LaToya Cottrell, who was in the midst of breaking a strike of Black sanitation workers by using imprisoned Black laborers to break the strike of Black garbage workers who were trying to ask for an increase of pay and hazard pay because their lives had been put at risk because of COVID. And so, you know, I think I sort of chart this end, and some of it is just is a provocation. You know, I don't think we're at the end of Black politics. I think that there's always been, or at least over the last 50 years, there's been a Black politics from above and there's been a Black politics from below. And so if anything, we're seeing the reemergence of a Black politics from below, the development and emergence of a Black political left with the movement for Black lives and the proliferation of organizations that have begun to form over the last 5 or 6 years, you know, which I think points to a tension that has always existed, but is much more ingrained and is becoming much more, is becoming deeper as you continue to have Black political leaders managing the crisis within cities and suburban areas where Black people live, that puts working class Black people in direct confrontation with Black municipal managers. And that's the dynamic I think that we have to look into, which I think creates the possibility for new alliances that you described in your question. Because I do think that when part of the reason, and I'll end with this, part of the reason I think why we are seeing such a large participation of white people in these BLM protests over the last month, over the month of June, is because of what Black Lives Matter has done is actually been successful in convincing a layer of white people that Black Lives Matter, and that white silence cannot continue to prevail. That has been successful, but I also think it speaks to the way that white millennials have also come to the realization that their lives don't matter in this country either, that they have been consigned to a life of debt. They have been marooned in jobs that will never allow them to pay off that debt, and that the whole premise of the American dream has been lost. And it's been lost for a generation of white people as well. They just give it, they pathologize us with, you know, white people, they call it deaths by despair, opioid addiction, alcoholism, and suicide. But whatever you want to call it represents a crisis in what this country used to stand for. And the Black movement, as it has always done, shows a potential way out of that. And that is what has attracted young white people to Black protests, because that seems like a more viable alternative than perhaps Joe Biden is.
So I think that's it's like a really incisive point to make about the fragmentation of Black politics in the post-civil rights era, and the ways in which these new movements have offered new lines of solidarity amidst these broader socioeconomic changes, right? I think your point about the failure of racial ideology in this moment to fracture solidarity along its normal lines is really well taken. And in a way, it kind of takes me back to the earliest moment of the post-civil rights era, which is the Black Power moment. And that's the moment where a lot of the dynamics you're laying out, Keeanga, get crystallized, right? This is the first time where Black municipal leaders get to take power. This is the first time where people are having to rethink the relationship in a sustained, systematic fashion between the Black politics from below and Black elected officials. And I'm curious because I don't actually see a lot of reflection on the Black Power era in this moment in the organs of debate. And I thought it would be a good thing for us to discuss a bit. And I was hoping, Robin, that you might say a little bit about two questions that have been on my mind, which are that in the wake of Black Power, there were two kind of criticisms from the left that I think had a real force for intellectuals coming out of it. One is that the emphasis on cultural politics and symbolic politics was too easily commodified and turned into just another consumer capitalist lifestyle. And you might think in our moment where PetSmart is sending me notes about how much Black Lives Matter, and Amazon is telling me about Black Lives Matter while having really awful policies toward its Black workers, we're in a similar moment. And that also leads me back to a thing that I think Keeanga dramatized quite well in that anecdote about New Orleans, is like, where's labor in all of this? So, one thing that the left has always pressed the Black Power era on was that in the fight between the different organizing models, the Black Power activists that pushed for labor unions to be the major vehicle of Black struggle in this moment, if they didn't lose in that moment, they certainly have lost in the public imaginary coming out of it. And I'm just curious as to your sense of those critiques and whether we've learned the right lessons from Black Power for now.
Right, yes, those are great questions. And let me also respond. Part of my answer is a response also to Keeanga's point. But to go back, the simple answer is that Clairol sponsored one of the first Black Power conferences in 1967. Okay, so of course, corporations are very quick to seize the language of Black struggle, Black movement, Black Lives Matter for Petco. Yes, that happens all the time. But I want to go back to a couple other examples. Keeanga talked about the sanitation worker strike. I just want to remind us that in 1977, under Mayor Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, he broke, this is Mayor Maynard Jackson, he broke the sanitation worker strike there. He would not negotiate, he used strike breakers, he fired all the strikers. And this is before, he was the model for Reagan's attack on Petco. So, in some respects, part of what I think Keeanga is talking about in terms of even today's neoliberal class divide in terms of Black politics, you can even see that in that period of Black power, and even going back earlier than that, that we see these kind of class, not just class tensions, but a real struggle over who will represent Black liberation. Black capitalists became the ones to claim the mantle of Black liberation. Remember at the New Politics Conference in Chicago in '67, Dr. King was in some ways shot down because he actually presented a much more of a class analysis, against those Black power leaders who pushed a more corporate line. And then because King pushed an anti-war position, because King pushed positions that were far more radical, more reflective of the politics of that we talked about before, the democratic socialist politics. And King was shut down by Black power, by a segment of Black power. But let me just focus on two specific things. One is, I think we haven't done enough homework to know the relationship between those people who identify with Black power and the labor movement. There is ample evidence, particularly in Detroit, of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, came out of the drum movement, and then the Black Workers Congress, which also came out of the League, where they built the most revolutionary program of any trade union movement in history. It was socialist, it was internationalist, it was anti-imperialist, it was anti-racist. They focused on workers' control. They built alliances with Arab American workers, with Latinx workers, and even with white workers. The Black Workers Congress came out of that. They didn't agree on everything, but they pushed the strategy demanding reparations as a way to build a revolutionary Black working class insurgency. And it wasn't just about people having like Cadillacs. It was about weakening capital, weakening the state's legitimacy, and building alliances with other progressive movements. And what happened? Well, they were defeated both because of the failure of white workers to actually support a revolutionary program. Not all white workers, some actually supported them. But then the other reason was because they were defeated by a kind of neoliberal rainbow coalition of junior partners. Many of them are Black and brown, who in the 1970s, as a new wave of elected officials, did not push that program. We could talk about Baraka and his experiment in Newark, and they were defeated by by a Black mayor and Black members of the city council. So you can begin to see those tensions even then. Then the final thing I just have to mention is, when we look at the role that labor plays, the most important labor union movement in that period of the 1960s and 70s, I think, was the National Welfare Rights Organization, right? So here we are, July 20th is the date marked for the strike for Black lives, okay? And that's coming up, people need to know about it. I could say more about that, but the strike for Black lives is an attempt to build union movement to fight for 15, to really highlight the fact that essential workers are not getting support and protection, and to also push back against this idea that corporations could claim Black Lives Matter as a mantle while oppressing and exploiting and undermining Black workers and putting them into danger, not just Black workers, but all workers, and putting them into danger. So having said that, I want to focus on the Welfare Rights Organization because who are the essential workers? The essential workers include reproductive work, reproductive labor. National Welfare Rights Organization, which still exists in some respects, have been fighting this fight to recognize reproductive labor as essential work. In fact, I would argue that Reverend Barber and Liz Steele Harris's Poor People's Movement is much closer to National Welfare Rights Organization than SCLC's campaign, right? And that they've been pushing for this. And just one last example, if you look at the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization under the leadership of Maureen Taylor and Marion Kramer, they had been fighting for 25 years against water shutoffs in Detroit in the privatization of water. And they need to be held up because this is where labor's fighting. They're fighting for environmental justice. They're fighting for people's ability to reproduce themselves as families, as human beings, and for basic needs. And so there's a long history, even in the era of Black power, of Black working class organizations trying to, basically push a radical agenda, an abolitionist agenda, a socialist agenda in some respects, but they end up being pushed out. So instead of thinking of it as, now we're starting to see a divide, I think that divide was there, but the divide is a divide that we have to pay attention to. We have to figure out, who, just like Cornell said, if we have a group of neoliberal politicians who are going to claim the mantle of speaking on behalf of oppressed peoples, then that plays a role in crushing this insurgent movement that has been there for a long time and continues to push for a kind of an agenda that is like liberatory for all, rather than, one that still sort of sees this kind of slow progression within a kind of multicultural neoliberal framework. So I know I said a lot, sorry, but that's how I see it.
I want to make sure that all of our audience, we've got over 800 people in attendance. I hope you all send some questions in. I'm about to open it up to everyone, but I want to just ask one last question to Elizabeth, just so we can get to the audience, if you could try to be brief. But I thought it would be really good, following on Robin's point. So one way you might see the era of experimentation that Robin's talking about is as a failure of federal policy to support grassroots organizations and create more democratic space for a kind of what we in political theory would call an agonistic democratic public, right? So all of these grassroots organizations being able to contest things that are happening in welfare bureaucracies and public parks departments and police, of course. And you've written a lot about the demise of that project. And so the final question before I turn it over to everyone is that for you, is this a moment to turn back toward federal support for that kind of investment? And is that a reason to try to persuade activists who see no interest in working alongside the state at this time to give up that purist stance and be more willing to experiment with the ideas of maximum feasible participation that you talk relatively fondly about in your book and in the New York Times?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, part of it is that people have lost faith or investment in the state for many of the reasons that we've been talking about, because the state has not worked for them. And I think that, there was this moment where the outcome could have been different. Mass incarceration was not something that was predetermined in the 1960s. And I think that's one of the real kind of tragedies of that era, is that there was this window where the federal government was granting autonomous local organizations directly. And I think, as Robin pointed out, every time there has been an extension of citizenship rights or any kind of abolitionist strain or tendency from slavery to Jim Crow, this insidious disease that's rooted in racism and capitalism, right, takes hold, so that new criminal laws, new forms of incarceration, new surveillance states, new segregationist regimes take hold. And that's what the failure was, right, of the first and second Reconstruction, even though, during Reconstruction, the federal government was instrumental in securing some of the most successful aspects of the Reconstruction program, from independent Black schools to the building of Black institutions. So, the federal government has been this really, has been a difficult or troubled ally in terms of bringing about racial justice, but it has played a role. And I think, we've been talking about the kind of need to move away from these neoliberal forms of governance that have restricted all of us. And I think in order, this new progressive surge of candidates that we're seeing and these new conversations within the party, one hopes that if we can bring about a vision of governance of what we've been talking about: full employment, guaranteed income, universal health care, rising to address the climate crisis, right? we can then return to this vision where the federal government, I think, should be funding these local efforts. And if we're going to address, and if we're going to reimagine society in the ways that we've been talking about, and we're going to address these issues and racial injustice in a new way, we have got to cede power to people. We've got to begin to facilitate that wealth redistribution by empowering local people to solve their own problems on their own terms. And we've got to be prepared to give something up in doing that, and to imagine a different kind of way that that federalism and government can be structured.
Well, thank you all so much for this. We're getting a ton of questions. Just to try to get as many as we can, we'll try to keep our answers short, and everybody should feel free to jump in. I might pose it to a person, but everyone should feel free to answer. And thank you, Liz, for ending us so strong. So one is a pushback at this description of BLM as a movement from below. So there's I read the question as one raising at least the problem of whether that's the appropriate description. What would make it a movement from below? Is it the class identity of its participants? It's obviously, again, the candidates that many of its leaders supported haven't been picked up. And to add to that, you might think there's another question about how to even think about legitimacy given the new structure of movement politics, right? So I always remember that New Yorker piece about Alicia Garza being stuck in traffic on the bridge because there was a protest from a Black Lives Matter organization that she didn't know about. But at the same time, if there's awards given or funding given, she's going to be one of the people that's put forward as the person to receive that. So like, how do we think about the legitimacy questions of the new movement structure and whether it's appropriate to describe it as a movement from below?
I think that there's a danger in simply looking at place and quantity as opposed to the quality of analysis and vision, and how, in fact, we're able to move from one point to the next. And what I mean by that is this, that for those of us who believe that the masses of Black people will never be free in a predatory capitalist civilization with imperial links around the world, with levels of wealth inequality, and with most of the money in militaristic and policing activity rather than in fulfilling social needs. Now, that is a vision and an analysis, if we had time to fill it out, that is crucial no matter who's out there. You see, you could have the masses out there supporting fascism. You see that in the Trump camp rally. See, it ain't a question of just numbers here. You see, part of the problem, I think, of the struggle of Black freedom is we're losing our sense of morality tied to integrity, honesty, decency, and spirituality tied to empathy and imagination. So that we think it's just a matter of who's out there, our particular identity vis-a-vis the people and so forth, rather than the quality and the level of what people see, what people analyze, and what people are courageously willing to sacrifice for. And that is, I mean, I know we don't have time to get into it now, but I mean, you know, it's like Brother Robin in his text on Monk, you know, you got to play yourself. You got to learn how to be nonconformist. You got to learn how to follow through on what you understand in relation to your love for the least of these, for poor and working people, and disproportionately Black. Because we have to be honest, if white supremacy were to disappear tomorrow, and I would break dance for about 3 days, but America remained predatory capitalist and imperialist, then I'm with Brother Ajumu Baraka and Black Alliance for Peace. I'm with Black Agenda Report, with Glenn Ford and Margaret and the others. It's still an exploitative society, you see. Now, we know those are tied together and it's complicated, but we have to be honest about that. And that's the lens through which we need to look at, as opposed to simply quantity and placement.
I would say that any movement is more, there are two things. One is any movement is more than its structures, its leadership. I think that if you go out to these, demonstrations, which the New York Times tells us it has involved more than 26 million people, that these are ordinary people at these protests. These are people who have been locked out of power. And we had a month of an uprising in the United States. Like, this is a movement from outside and from below. Now, are there and then even within Black Lives Matter itself, regardless of the particular class position of individuals who might make up an organization, is that this is a movement that is trying to transform basic aspects of American society and who stand outside of the realms of power. And so, of course, within any movement, there are questions about democracy, accountability, who speaks for whom. And I think that in some ways that these questions were unresolved in the first iteration of Black Lives Matter. They remain unresolved in this current manifestation of protest. But I would say every social movement has to wrestle with those questions and how its political agenda is formed, and how the relationship, the constant dialectic of a membership and a leadership. And everybody wants to say that we're leaderful and we don't have, well, we know that there are always leaders, but there are leaders who are accountable and there are leaders who are not. And every movement has to figure that out. But those questions don't, I think, diminish or transform the quality of or the way that we can understand and characterize this as a bottom-up movement that is trying to transform fundamental aspects of the United States.
That's great. So next question, which I thought was a really interesting one. So there's a question on the table. I'm going to try to tie two together. There's a question on the table about the framing of the third Reconstruction. And they're asking that so much momentum in the Democratic Party, the sort of left wing of the Democratic Party, is around the New Deal as an anchoring frame for policy, the Green New Deal, a New Deal. What's the distinction? What's the benefit in framing things around the idea of Reconstruction rather than the idea of the New Deal? And to add to that, just a little addendum, is reparations a part of that discussion? And is that a sort of central piece of why it might matter to take that alternative framing?
Well, I think one is that, the New Deal was not about fundamental reconstruction and revolution. It was about the managing of a capitalist crisis and the transfer of wealth to poor and working people without them being in leadership positions. This is very important. So that when we talk about Reconstruction, and I think like Brother Eddie's talking about the third founding, we've got to be revolutionary, calling for fundamental transformation. That's Martin too, that Brother Robin talked about. Fundamental transformation was about a transfer of power, wealth, resources, and respect. That's something that's much deeper in that regard. So that right now, the neoliberal wing of the ruling class, which is a Democratic Party establishment, and then the neo-fascist wing of the ruling class, which is Trump and his folk, that none of them want to talk about fundamental transformation. They're still talking about managing the system, and they don't want to allow for a focus on poor and working people being in positions of power where their voices are shaping their destinies and having some significant control. So that's a very important distinction to make here, and we missed that in the 60s that Robin talked about. The Cold War liberalism was about social programs. It was much more about siding with the flag and supporting the Vietnam War rather than decolonization around the world. Instead of full employment, supported decolonization and calling for workers' power, people's power, all power to the people. That's not just the Charlites, that's the Black Panther Party. Why? Because they were focused where they should have been focused, on the least of these. That moment in the 25th chapter of Matthew, that's part of my revolutionary Christian tradition. But I'm gonna stop now.
Robin, do you want to jump in, or can I ask you another question?
Oh yeah, ask another question. I'll add. I mean, Cornell said it better than anyone, so you know.
We got Charlites, Keith Sweat. What is next?
Check your bingo card. So there's a question on the table, and it's a thing that you've written just so powerfully about and a lot about, and something I've actually wanted to ask you for a long time. So I'm glad this person asked it. That they're wondering, what's the role of internationalism in this moment, right? That what's should be the movement for Black lives orientation toward internationalism and geopolitics. And I will put a little more another kind of thing on it that I like you to sort of speak to. So I think for those of us who study the civil rights and Black power eras, we have a certain understanding of Black internationalism that's operating within a Cold War perspective, right? So the thing that's true about the Soviet Union and many of the anti-colonial struggles of that moment is that they're aspiring to a kind of egalitarian ideal. And right now, the geopolitics are really different. They're anchored by states that do not openly espouse egalitarian ideals. China is not engaged right now in an egalitarian project or democratic project. Much of the Middle East is not engaged in egalitarian democratic project. There are fascist movements all over Europe clamoring for power. It's a much, much different political realm. And so I'm just curious, as someone who's thought a lot about the internationalism, is there anything that we can do that's more than just showing moral solidarity, right? Is there any real power game here to the international realm in the present?
Right. Well, to go back to one thing, I mean, movement, I would make a distinction between movement for Black lives and Black Lives Matter, and that movement for Black lives, as everyone knows, represents like a coalition of like 70, 80 different organizations, many of which are actually engaged in international relationships, in national solidarity. I mean, it's hard to understand mobilizing around post-Katrina, New Orleans, for example, without seeing the role that all these organizations on the ground played in this relationship with Venezuela, for example, or Cuba. And even right now in this moment, state violence, whether we're talking about Brazil, whether we're talking about France, whether we're talking about England, whether we're talking, all over the globe, the murder of George Floyd and all the other surrounding murders have kind of touched a nerve, which is why these demonstrations have been international. But tie that to pre-existing organizing work from some of those same organizations that are involved with Strike for Black Lives, that have been doing cross-border organizing, that have been trying to build labor relationships across the board, dealing with sweatshop labor. I mean, even the No Sweat campaign, sweatshop labor in Vietnam, in China, in Haiti. These are the kinds of alliances and solidarities that were already being built ahead of time. And that's why I say that, the third Reconstruction ideal can't be reduced to a national vision. It is a global vision because this is a global economy. And this is also a global regime of oppression. And then one thing I just want to add to that, I mean, Cornell said it perfectly, about, the distinction between a movement for revolutionary transformation and a political party. The Republican Party in the 1860s and 70s was not Reconstruction. It embodied aspects of it. The Democratic Party definitely was not the Reconstruction movement. And in fact, part of what we have to do to reconstruct the story is to look at organizations and movements that may not necessarily be mass movements, but whose vision, like Cornell says, is one that's profoundly international, profoundly radical, one that's not moving toward an improved state, but possibly the dismantling of the nation state as we know it. And so I draw attention to this great book that everyone should read. This is Keeanga's wonderful collection of interviews around the Combahee River Collective, which is one of the organizations that, to me, in the 1970s, really embodied all dimensions of a kind of revolutionary abolitionist project that is both international, that is focused on race, class, gender, and that really refuses to accept anything less than a kind of socialist alternative to oppression. And finally, that paid attention to forms of state violence and state-sanctioned violence that no one was paying attention to.
You know, Keeanga, following up on Robin's point, one of the things that struck me most about your remarks in this conversation was this line about, well, you got U.S. hospital workers dressed in garbage bags and like shredded Yankees jerseys, while the police are looking like they stepped out of a Michael Bay movie, right? And I think it's a time of deep humility for a lot of us in the United States who hadn't already gotten there. I mean, Robin's ahead of everybody on that, but a lot of us hadn't gotten there and are in a moment of real self-inventory and self-reflection. And I'm wondering, for someone like you who's thought so much about the contemporary movements, is there something that we could learn from struggles elsewhere around the world, from the global South? I mean, that's one of the questions on the table that I'm getting. Like, what can these movements learn? So that not just moving beyond a US focus, but what can we learn from a place of humility about what's working in other countries to change this country, as you put it?
I think one of the things that is different now, aside from the collapse of national liberation movements, which really shaped the third world solidarity of the previous period, is the way that globalization has bound together the ruling elite of different countries. So the G7 or the G8 and the Davos crowd and the way that they have cohered around a set of political and economic principles that then get diffused across the world. And so I think that there are there are several different examples that I think that we can look to. There are movements for housing rights. In Berlin, for example, you know, after a very long campaign, the activists in Berlin were able to get the city government there to impose a 5-year rent freeze so that landlords could not impose or to raise rents over a 5-year period. There are different kinds of movements for housing rights across Europe. For example, there are struggles around abortion rights and against gender violence in Chile, in South America, for example, that have been able to really become mass movements. I think some of the struggle around what Robin talked about as the politics of reproduction politics, social production, have gained currency across the global South, but also in Europe, where the March 8th Women's International Day protests have actually been real political strikes with mass movements, mass demonstrations involving hundreds of thousands of people. And so some of this, you know, I think that we can look to as in an aspirational way as to what size and influence our movements need to get to as a way to actually transform politics. But it also speaks to historic issues that we have in this country that involve the labor movement, that involve the institutionalization of social democracy and socialist organization in the first place, the historic issues in the US with the development and cohesion of a political left, and how one does that with the relentless assault of the American state. These are all questions that it's not necessarily that other places have figured out, that they have different histories and traditions that may mean that that level of organizing is in a more advanced place that we can learn from, but it highlights some of the deficits that we suffer from and have to fix. And I think that what we're seeing now is that we don't have forever to figure it out. I think some of the things that we thought were somewhere off in the distance, whether it was climate and the temperature of the planet, and were important issues to take on, but these are issues in the future. The future is now. It's here. There is an airborne pandemic that there is no end in sight, no matter what the happy talk of the Trump administration or whomever else may be. The reality is we don't know where this is going. So there's an urgency to being serious about these questions and engaging them. And I think that, there are particular points of struggle that we can look at, but it's not in and of itself enough to overcome the deficits that we have here, that we, as those of us who are trying to reconstitute a left, who see us as ourselves as part of a left, have to take on head on.
Elizabeth, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else about, I know you've been looking at prison reform movements, prison abolition movements globally. If you wanted to add anything else, I think to Keeanga-'s important admonition to think about particularity, even as we take on the lessons from other places.
Well, I think one of the things among many that COVID-19 has unmasked is just the seedbed that our prison system is, and that mass incarceration has wrought for inequality and for all of these health disparities, and has undergirded the fact that the transition to mass incarceration as this mechanism for social control is a massive failure, and that the very fact that prisons are the hot spots through which COVID is spreading. You have tens of thousands of people who are stuck there behind bars, who were sentenced at very young ages, and who are now older men and women and should be released, don't pose a harm to society, and are now in prison getting COVID. So I think, again, as we're thinking about this reimagining of society and reimagining what public safety means, as we're thinking about it in terms of defunding the police, that needs to be linked to how we're thinking about incarceration, and incarceration as really the anchor of so many of these systems that we're talking about. So the idea of cutting police forces in half as kind of an immediate necessity should be paired with, and often is paired with, cutting the prison population in half, which has been a discussion that we've been having for a while. And again, like, what kind of resources does then this initial step open up to providing a new kind of way of approaching issues of justice and safety, one that is based on care and not violence, because the prison is an institution of continued violence. And I think what we're seeing with the pandemic is really underscoring that.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw that piece the other day that says prisoners are 550% more likely to contract COVID, and 300% dying at 300% the rate of others at comparable ages and backgrounds. So, I mean, it's just a stunning, again, back to Keeanga-'s point, it's just, there's no way to segregate these social problems the way that a lot of late 20th century, early 21st century social policy was built upon. And the time is now to dramatically wrestle with the questions that confront us. We have time for one last question. And I want to allow all of you all to speak to it. but I'll pose it to Brother West first, which is that, you know, as has come up many times throughout the discussion, one of the things that I think has people really excited about this moment, but also a bit wary, is the enormous enthusiasm among millions of non-Black people, particularly young white people, for protest, for supporting the demands of BLM, for having a radical reckoning with the catastrophic, ignoble past of this nation. And there's a question that always comes up, and it's come up here, about what white allies can do, what non-Black allies can do in this moment. And I also want to add to that a bit about what kinds of practices should allies or people engaged in solidarity be wary of, because there's a lot of things that are being marketed or being championed under the name of authentic allyship. And it's an important time, I think, to signal to people what is, particularly people who haven't thought as much as we have about these questions, what is and is not a self-undermining use of their time and energy and effort and emotional energy. So I was hoping that you might speak to that and then let everybody else say their final piece.
Yeah, it's very brief. I mean, one is we've got to go back to the history. If you look at the lives of John Brown and Lydia Maria Child and Miles Horton and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Ann Braden, we can go down. There's a whole lot of vanilla brothers and sisters who've been part of the Black freedom struggle, but they didn't have a discourse about white fragility. You see, they had discourse about integrity. They had a discourse about what it means to have solidarity, you see. And that's very important because white supremacist civilization has a genius of making every issue evolve around white fears, insecurities, and anxieties, rather than Black suffering, indigenous people suffering, trans suffering, no matter what color, gay, lesbian suffering. So that it's that self-indulgent, narcissistic move, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how progressive, in inverted commas, we have to accent here. And so in that regard, we're really talking about solidarity across the board. When I'm in solidarity with my gay and lesbian sisters and brothers as a straight, I'm not talking about straight fragility. I'm talking about my solidarity. I want to be a decent human being. I want to make sure their lives have the same dignity and respect as anybody else. And why? And this is what I want to end on. And that's the issue of despair. With the pandemic on the one hand, the fascist gangster in the White House in the other, depression-like levels of massive unemployment, underemployment, the collapse of our educational systems and so forth. Yes, we have been living in a failed social experiment on every front. The economy, the nation state, our educational system, most of our religious institutions, they have failed to actually generate what a democracy ought to, which is a healthy public life in which people are not poor and not had to deal with inadequate housing. They have access to health care. They have access to quality education. So when it comes to 40%, especially of our population, it failed. But we got to try again, fail better. How do you fail better? You have to have spiritual resources to deal with despair. And that's what we learned from our brothers and sisters on the West Bank under his vicious Israeli occupation, or it could be Jews in Russia, or it could be the Dalit in India. It could be the Roma in Europe. What is it? They have a despair that they're wrestling with, but they're defeatless in their determination to be decent human beings with integrity before the worms get their body. If you miss out on that spiritual resource, you're gonna miss out on the greatness of Black folk. That's what Monk was about. That's what Coltrane was about. That's what Aretha was about. An integrity and a quest for excellence to get beyond what they had been exposed to and then to pass it on to the younger generation, given what was inside of their souls. If we miss out on that, then a lot of this is just sounding brass and tinkling cymbals.
Ashe, amen.
I just think this whole ally thing just has to go. I'm sorry. I'm not interested in allies, because it makes it seem like, well, over here in our America, everything's great. We just need to improve your America so that yours can. No, have you looked at what is happening in their America? I mean, I talked about it before. The life expectancy of ordinary white men and women has gone into reverse. Mm-hmm. This does not happen in the developed world. And it is driven by alcoholism, drug addiction, and suicide.
That's right. That's right.
That is not white privilege. That is white pathos. So we all need to be figuring out what the hell to do to change this clusterfuck of a country. Because I will tell you that racism is Black people's burden, but it's all of our problem. And you can look at what is happening now with COVID. Because the Democratic Party and the Republicans were so skillful and adept at using racism to undermine and ultimately destroy our social welfare system, it means now, some years later during a pandemic, it is completely broken. And that means that we get $1,200 checks if you're lucky before August, and that's it. That's what social welfare produces in the United States. And why is it like that? Because they used racism to undermine the whole system of social welfare by convincing white people that Black people were freeloaders trying to get something for nothing. So racism is all of our problem. And we all, for regular people, the 1% don't care. But for everyone else, you know, convincing white people that they're making, you know, a dime and Black people are making a nickel, and so haven't we gotten over? That's a little bit of what we're dealing with. So we have to move this conversation beyond allyship to talk about what is actually happening in the United States and what are the strategies and tactics and politics and understanding of history that are necessary to transform it so that all of our lives can improve. And saying that doesn't mean that we're all suffering the same. Clearly, when we see how this pandemic is affecting African Americans, we see what is happening on the border of this country, we can see that there are people who are suffering more than others. But in the United States, this is a country of suffering. And we're saying is that there are the resources that this suffering doesn't have to exist. This country gives the Pentagon almost $1 trillion a year. The resources exist so that this level of suffering does not have to exist. So we have to fight to change the political dynamics to end suffering, period. And you don't do that with liberal discourse about allyship.
Well, I think it's hard to imagine a more powerful and searing way to end this conversation. Where do we go from here? I think you may have thought my introductions at the beginning were over the top. I hope you understand how wrong you've been proven. This panel was incredible. It lived up and exceeded my expectations. And I encourage all of you to do a couple of things. One, live with integrity, like Brother West says. Join the movement, find a way that you can contribute, but also support these independent bookstores, support the organizations that we've listed to fundraise for. Again, they are National Bailout, Critical Resistance, and OWL out of Stockton, California. And I just want to thank Robin Kelley, Elizabeth Hinton, Cornell West, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor for their brilliance and their devotion. You can't just get off the couch and do this kind of thing. They've committed a life of study to these issues, and it shows. So I love you guys, and thank you all for coming and spending the evening with us.
Steve, love you right back, brother. Love you right back.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, everybody.
Each and every one of you.
Here's a look at some books being published this week. Historian Rick Perlstein